pleased to welcome you in this new interview of 30 Minutes With, a series of interviews with African academics, artists, policymakers, and to discuss current African issues. We are in Accra, Ghana, and we are going to start a series of interviews with African designers, activists, and to start with, we have someone that is no longer to be introduced in the Ghanaian intellectual, if I may say, scene. He's the coordinator of Third World Network Africa, a Pan-African research and advocacy organization based in Accra, Ghana. Third World Network covers the areas of economic policy, international trade, investment, and the role of international financial institutions on African development, gender and development, and economic policy. Especially they focus on the mining sector. Our guest today has been involved in activism and written extensively on Africa and global development issues since the mid-1970s, working with key organizations such as trade unions over the years. He is a member of the coordinating committee of Social Watch and the Africa editor of the Review of African Political Economy, and he holds a doctoral degree from Warwick University. So I am pleased to introduce Dr. Yaw Graham. Welcome, Dr. Graham.
Good morning.
And thank you for having us today in your office of Third World Network. We are very pleased that you were able to accept our invite to have this interview. So
it's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you after so many. So we met in Senegal at IDEP when I was working there. And Dr. Graham delivered several trainings and did monthly development seminars on the Africa Mining Vision, actually.
Yes.
So today we are here to discuss Ghana's development challenges, and I think we will more extensively talk about Africa's development challenges. And to start with, could you please tell us more about yourself, your background, the circumstances in which you created Third World Network, you co-founded it?
Third World Network Africa was founded in 1994. Maybe it came into existence in 1994, but the discussions about this started slightly earlier. Initiative was primarily driven by a gentleman called Charles Abu Ghraib, who had some experience of the NGO scene in Ghana and internationally. Who also had contact with Third World Network globally. But the group of us who founded Third World Network have been variously associated, on the Ghanaian left, through the student movement, through mass politics in the early 80s, who had all distanced ourselves from the Rawlings regime, which in the early 80s, showed some progressive promise, but we all fell out with it. But we remain interested in how we could continue to work, around the things that we were committed to. And at the time, a group of us were in London, and the conversations were really about what would be the best organizational form through which to work. And as the political situation liberalized in the early 80s, the idea of policy research and advocacy organization looked like an interesting kind of vehicle. So that's how we came to create Third World Network as one of a complex of organizations which will work together. So for example, we also set up a public interest law organization called CEPIL to provide pro bono legal services. We set up 2 publications, African Agenda as a Pan-African magazine, and we also set up Public Agenda as a domestic newspaper, all of which were supposed to work together, on these issues. And then there was a domestic NGO, ISODEC. So this constellation of organizations represented, what we thought would together be able to work. But personally, my entry into the NGO space really was a curious kind of evolution because I'd come out of the political movement first as a student activist in the University of Ghana in the 70s, even going back to secondary school and interest in Pan-African and domestic, just issues about social justice and fairness, the way it usually starts, a kind of a bit of moral outrage, a bit of ethical concern, and then it becomes a bit more philosophical as you read. And the university was very important in that, because then you began to get into trying to get some intellectual, as it were, grade, for the way you feel. Began to take part in some of the early attempts at building organization. Then, of course, I went as a student to England, where in terms of my own academic work also, and being in the UK at a time when the last stages of the national liberation movement were still evolving around Southern Africa, at the time when Central Africa was the time of progressive kind of upset. Was a great time for my own kind of formation. But I think critical in my development was a decision I took in 1982 after Jerry Rawlings returned to power. I decided to get my PhD and come back to Ghana to work, in politics, because the early promise of the Rawlings regime, popular expectation of the government as something that would deliver some progressive possibilities. Many of us young people on the left saw some possibilities, and I got my PhD, and I came back, and for 7 years I worked full-time as a political activist. In the first 3 years, I was one of the national leaders of the defense committee systems that the regime called into being. The People's and Workers' Defense Committees were a kind of mass mobilization vehicle through which ordinary people try to assert, their participation and interest, in the Rawlings, in the promises of the post-Rawlings coup. I mean, they were among some of the organizations that were quickly suppressed, as the contradictions between the mass line, and the orientation of the regime, particularly when it went to structural adjustments, became very strong. And I spent a lot of my time actually working with workers in Tema, which is the main industrial city outside Accra. And I was also one of the leaders of the New Democratic Movement, which was one of the several left-wing organizations that supported the PNDC regime in that period. From when we broke with Rawlings at the end of 1984, we continued to work, with the student movement and also with the unions on precisely the same issues, which have been the basis for their support for Rawlings. But those same issues actually became points of conflict. We used to joke in those days, what amounts to deviation is defined by power. So that if you continue to follow on the old line, when the leadership has changed course, it is not you who has deviated. It is not the leadership who has deviated, but you, the weak person who still went in a straight line, who has deviated. So when the regime deviated, we were accused of deviation, and put in prison and so on.
But you were in prison.
Yes. So in the wake of that, I went back to England to finish my PhD. So it was in England that these conversations about how to continue to work politically led to a group of us, who have been associated in that period, deciding to form the Third World Network, as a vehicle. So the Third World Network, in that sense, is not a classic NGO that you find in many African countries, where it's a kind of third employment sector, okay? Because those who founded it actually could be doing other things. In fact, one of the founders became a very senior person, in the African Development Bank. One of the founders, it's currently the president of Kodeshra, and also one of the founders he got a first class in law, could have gone back to teach in the law faculty, but we all opted, to set this thing up as a kind of vehicle for our political work. So it was very explicitly seen as a chance to exploit the liberalized political space, not simply as something for employment.
And since then you have been with Third World Network.
Yes. And
you were just referring to the Pan-African perspective and the holistic approach that Third World Network is using. And this is not new. Since in 2005, we co-authored the book with Jimmy Adesina and Adebayo Okoshi. And the book was on Africa and development challenges in the new millennium. And you were in particular talking about the new partnership for Africa's development. So 10 years later, if you have to look back, what is, in your opinion, the meaning of NEPAD today?
An institution, and of NEPAD as a policy framework. NEPAD institution is a curious creature. Okay, nominally part of the African Union Commission's architecture, but in many ways autonomous. Autonomous in ways which are not always beneficial. Let me give an example. I mean, NEPAD is the entry point through which promoters of the Natural Resource Charter, which is really an initiative by some private citizens in the global north, together with some right-wing academics, are trying to insist that there has to be some global governance framework for extractives. Now, this closely linked with the World Bank and so on and so forth. It's competing with the African Mining Vision, which is a policy framework adopted by African heads of state. Okay, and the AMV status in the in NEPAD's stable, it's probably on the same level as the Natural Resource Charter. So it's become this curious, institution through which I think a certain kind of a vector for donor entry, into the center of African policy making. NEPAD, the policy framework, in a way has evolved in a disparate fashion. Our critique of NEPAD at the time was that a project of continental kind of unity on a development vision could not be anchored in expectations of aid, funding, and foreign investment, and the terms of which would simply be an institutionalization of some of the things we complain about around the structural adjustment. So under the rubric of NEPAD, a number of initiatives have taken place of a fairly eclectic kind of character. But I think if you look post-NEPAD, I think the growth spurt, that the continent experienced, the 10-year growth period from the early noughties to maybe about 2015, even if you include the period of the crash, 2008, 2009, basically has been claimed by the protagonist of NEPAD, but it has also, that growth has also raised questions about the model, because the growth has seen intensified inequality. The growth has been driven largely by extractives, which has increased the continent's dependence on commodities, and also highlighted really the limits of that model. So what you find currently is really that, in a certain sense, there are some key initiatives which are taking place on the continent, which reflect the, shall we say, the kind of more progressive agenda than NEPAD envisaged. The recognition, for example, that this continent and economies would not go anywhere without structural transformation and industrialization. That we should do something about creating jobs. That we should do something about dealing with inequality, and how these have led to various kind of policy frameworks at the continental and regional levels. Now, if you go back to the NEPAD document, NEPAD in a way tried to marry the more radical early post-colonial vision of Pan-Africanism with the kind of more neoliberal vision of neoliberalism, the more kind of open regionalism thing about markets and so on. Currently, I would say that the expectation of a stronger role for the state has come back in a way that at the time NEPAD was formulated, was not the case. But having said that, at the same time, we can say that in many countries, domestic policy making is some distance from these grand continental visions, which have a slightly more radical kind of agenda, which threw back a bit more to a recognition that the early post-colonial period and the policies of that period were not mistaken, even if there were mistakes made in how they were implemented. That the basic analysis of the continent's problems from that period remain valid. So we have a fairly eclectic situation. And you also find, in my view, that in many countries, really, the excitement about electoral politics has begun to wane. People have seen the limits, of changing, parties, which don't really represent any change in direction. So we are at a moment where you have a mix of recognition expressed in some initiatives for a radical agenda of change, a more progressive agenda, which basically challenges the paradigm of neoliberalism. But we have a dominance at the domestic levels of neoliberalism, both because of the fact that the institutional cadre who have been built over the past 30 years are very much, wedded, to that. And of course, also economies develop their own dynamic, where kind of new social layers, new economic interests kind of become more prominent. So those who have an interest in a different agenda, I think there's been substantial demobilization because of the mechanism of electoral politics driven by patronage and sectarian considerations based on religion, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, where the parties really are not policy vehicles. They're just periodic vehicles that are called into being on the eve of elections, and so that the elite can alternate power whilst policy does not change. So in the 10 years since NEPAD, this, in my view, is how the policy thing has moved. Some positive developments, but the persistence of some of the more intractable challenges and orientations.
And we will discuss more about the electoral carousel that you were denouncing in the Rope interview. But now let's focus on Ghana. You were talking about the disconnect between the kind of international policy making and what is happening at domestic level. So if you recall, in the Ghana Vision 2020, which was launched in 1995, targeted for Ghana to be a middle-income country within one generation. And in 2010, Ghana rebased its national account, and was considered by the World Bank as having graduated and became a middle-income country, low middle-income country. So what, in your opinion, since 2011, 2010 that this happened, this rebasement and Ghana becoming a middle-income country, what were the implications of this and what concretely has changed?
Rama, let's put it this way. If you went to sleep the day before the announcement of the rebasing, and you woke up the day after, and you went around, and you heard people tell you that Ghana has become a middle-income country, you rub your eyes and you ask, how many years have I been asleep? Because nothing, as you know, statistically, things changed, but in substance, not the whole lot changed. But some things changed in terms of the ways in which the elite began to see the country, see themselves, evaluate their achievements, and also begin to make certain kind of policy choices. Because the lower middle income status had consequences in terms of what kinds of international aid or capital you can get. I mean, certain sources of aid began to dry up. But I don't think that really, consistent with the complete absence, in my view, of any strategic vision for this country, there's any thinking through about what this transition will mean in terms of, resourcing, development, and so on and so forth, for a country which, for the preceding 20 years, have been very heavily dependent, on aid. Of course, the rebasing also and the attainment of middle income status came was aided by the discovery of oil. So per capita income went up. And if you were around from the discovery of oil, the excitement about what oil meant, kind of really exaggerated, proclamations were made. I think President Kufuor, who was in office at the time, used a mixed metaphor, that Ghana will become an African, lion which will fly, and there's a lot of that exaggerated expectation. Now, if you look at what has happened to the economy since, the oil income has allowed the government to be less dependent on donor money. But the additional oil to the country's basket of exports has meant that Ghana actually is even more commodity dependent. It's on a small basket. Oil and gold, and cocoa represent about almost 80% of the country's exports. So all you need is a little fluctuation, in the prices of these commodities. If you look at what happened recently with the drop in the oil price and also with gold, the consequences have been quite far-reaching in terms of the public revenues, in terms of the country's ability to support its kind of heavy consumption of imports. A country which is very largely de-industrialized, agrarian sector where productivity has been stagnant, for a very long time. So we have about 40% plus of the population in the agricultural sector, but they produce less than 20% of the GDP, which is not an unusual pattern, of course, on the continent. So the middle income status really doesn't tell you very much about the substance, of the economy. I mean, a study that was done in 2013 or 2014 points to 2013, I think, the latest Ghana Living Standard Survey. Inequality is worsening, and the hardcore of poverty, remains kind of very strong, and the economy is not creating jobs. So the middle income thing has not affected, the character of the economy, and the policy choices being made actually not addressing this problem at all. If anything, the modalities of raising money, the country has issued a lot of bonds, over the years at pretty high, interest rates. There are big questions about how these monies are being used, the rebuilding of public debt and what it represents in terms of contribution to national development. So many issues.
And should be cautious with this narrative. And connected to what you just said, you declared in a Rope interview recently that the management of the economy has been the Achilles heel of Ghana, despite the electoral carousel of the political elite. I was going to provocatively ask, is it, if this wasn't a rather doom and gloom assessment of your own?
What is very clear is that,
you're not very...
Other Africans love Ghana. You're talking to friends from Senegal, DRC, from Uganda, and you start complaining, say, hey, stop. Ghana is wonderful. And say, I live there. I say, yeah, you live there, but you don't know, Now, I mean, what has struck me from those conversations is that, on a comparative basis, there are some things in Ghana which are positive and are worth working to make sure they are preserved and improved. But I also think that because of basically the fact that across the continent, you'll be hard put to point to one government, that you can say makes you happy. In that situation, people have lowered their standards, you know. So what really we should treat as the floor of our expectations has become the ceiling of our expectations. But it's important not to allow yourself to be overwhelmed by it. In a way, it's a way of internalizing, you know, the negativity. You internalize and say, okay, if it's well, maybe, you know, let's take the fact that Ghana has, you know, elections without too much violence, you know, are so great that we should be happy about it. That is true. But let's return to the question about the economy. I mean, Ghana has had steady growth since the mid-80s. Now, that is important because one of the things about Ghana in the late 70s was that Ghana had one of the fastest declining economies in the world. Within a decade, the economy has shrunk by 25% as a result of mismanagement, as a result of, you know, kind of a commodity price questions and so on and so forth. So when the economy started growing, it was an important shift away from a negative. But the structural issues that face this economy, in terms of its, say, integrated character, its ability to create jobs and sustainable livelihoods, haven't changed kind of fundamentally. And Ghana became a model in the 80s, late 80s, basically for restoration of colonial type economies. So the growth has been powered by the rebuilding of the old export sectors. I mean, Ghana talks, the governments talk constantly about how Ghana, you know, is planning to, you know, hit 1 million tons, you know, in cocoa production and remain there. So I'm asking, but, you know, we're importing 200 million cedis of $200 million of poultry, okay? And we are aspiring to produce 1 million tons of so there's a commodity dependence trap in the minds of the elite, okay? I mean, you take oil. Ghana's oil is not Saudi Arabia quantity, to put it, you know, it's the same quantity as Cameroon. And yet when you talk to many Africans, they think Ghana's oil is fantastic. And many of them don't know that Cameroon is an oil producer. It's all part of the Ghanaian, the exaggeration, you know, of the Ghanaian model. And the oil thing has led to a complete frenzy, and also therefore a movement away from a more systematic kind of approach to trying to transform the economy. And both main parties basically are committed to that. They are more interested in keeping the foreign investor happy than in what they are going to, the risk they will take to move this economy away from commodity dependence, to try and to build more seriously around, you know, regional integration, so that we are solving, you know, the problems together. So this is basically what I meant. It is not doom and gloom, but that's the reality from which you have to start. That if you took either the NDC, which is now in power, or the NPP, which is in opposition, and which could come back to power, you know, with the next election, fundamentally over the past 20 plus years, when they've alternated, they've not been kind of, you know, very, very, very different. Recently we took the government on in respect of a new contract they gave to one of the big mining companies, Goldfields. They gave them some new tax concessions. Those terms are completely illegal, but they defend it because we need to, you know, keep the mines working and so on. I mean, these are not renewable resources. If you go through illegality to keep a company going, then you might as well make it a free-for-all. There's a big discussion now about the privatization of the Electricity Corporation of Ghana. The president was in the media recently making some vast pronouncements about the need to take risk and, you know, basically set out some strong men to attack those of us who are critical of the decision. But when you look closely at what they are offering, they are ready to offer a foreign company guarantees for their profitability, guarantees for the payment of utility bills by public entities, which the government did not offer to the publicly owned Electricity Corporation of Ghana, which contributed to the collapse of the company. And yet they will offer that to a foreign company, which would then be successful and say, you see, publicly owned, locally managed, not good. Foreign, private, best. So these guys are complicit in even creating a climate of doubt about our own ability to manage our affairs.
So how can change happen in this context when
we keep struggling?
They are talking about resilience and having home-ground strategies and so on, and not relying on domestic companies to operate this change.
I mean, you need to keep making the same points in as many contexts as possible. You need to keep building alliances around the issues as they arise. Okay, and in our experience as Tewa Network, even though we may not claim big victories, I mean, there are many positive lessons from what we work. I mean, if you take the work that we've done, for example, around trade policy, you take the work we've done around the economic partnership agreements, with allies in the Africa Trade Network. I mean, the EPA should have been signed like 10 years ago, 2007. We are still here. It's still drawn out. I mean, it's a combination of the fact that people campaigned, raised awareness about the negative implications of the EPAs for our development space, but in the process also build alliances, people in the technocracy, people in political office, and people in the private sector, as well as people in popular organizations like the unions, people in faith-based organizations and so on and so forth. And in different situations, you find different permutations of those. So in Ghana here, in that process, one of the interesting alliances that we developed was with the Poultry Farmers Association. And the Poultry Farmers, in a way, are an interesting organization because they are in an industry which has many positives, potential positives, that if you increase your domestic poultry production, you don't only reduce imports and free your foreign exchange to do other things. You also create an industry which has a lot of linkages. Okay, so people producing cereals and other inputs for feed would have a bigger market. You increase you also then have your agro-processing. Because with a certain scale, you can begin to process, so those producing packaging and so on and so forth. The people who now are using their networks to sell imported, frozen chicken can begin to move around. More people can eat local chicken. There are nutrition things you can do. So they have proposals about how eggs could be incorporated in the National School Feeding Program, 1 egg a day for each child and so on. So if we just see the multipliers, because jobs are created. Okay. Now they didn't start from there, but as the conversations wore on and they moved from their concern about we want a poultry industry that survives, they began to see the trade, linkages. People in the Association of Ghana Industry who are used to sitting quietly in the corner with the government and saying, please, we beg, can you help us? This began to see that they too could begin to kind of raise their voices, in policy and so on. And all those things contribute in different ways to transforming the culture of citizenship. Because one of the reasons why things are not happening is that it's not that people can't see. It's not that people are not unhappy about the way things are going. But, the culture around power in many of our countries, people it's a kind of a reflex of deference. Okay. So you're talking to people in mining communities and they can analyze their problem very sharply, what they want, but what do they want to do? They want to write a petition to the minister when their rights are being violated. Okay, I said no. You have constitutional rights which are being violated. Demand respect for your rights. It's a completely different thing from petition. So even the ideologies around power and accountability, those are all things which are part of the baggage, and as you know, I mean, shifting ideas represent one of the most difficult challenges because all around you on a daily basis, dominant ideas are being, you know, kind of reinforced. So, but when I look back at the work that we've done, I'm quite happy about some of the things that we've been able to do and the relationships that we've built, and also some of the lessons that, you know, we've learned. And you can also even examine the failures and see that within that also are the seeds of being able to do better the next time. Kind of great. It's a tough business, you know. But look, Rama, the thing is that all of us, unless you are depressed, okay, we are kind of spontaneous optimists because each morning we get out of bed believing that we can do something before the sun goes down. So we keep trying.
And on this word of optimism, and we would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for accepting to have this interview and having us in your office. We really appreciate it. You are such an inspiration, and it's a pleasure meeting you again. And thank you for your time, for your availability, and we hope to be staying in touch with you. Thank you.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.